continuing developments in MLB labor strife. Owners and players failed to reach an agreement last week. Commissioner Rob Manfred has announced that the season will not start on time. Some series have been pushed back. The players have taken the last few days as an opportunity to drop firebombs on Rob Manfred on social media platforms in a constant barrage. And that means that we could only have the great Hannah Kaiser of Yahoo Sports come to tell us whose fault is it this time? What is going on? And are the owners capable of negotiating in good faith literally ever? Hannah Kaiser, welcome to Takeline.
All right, you want me to answer this one at a time? You guys always have
sure, yes, do it.
The dog said fun stuff. Whose fault is it this time? Well, the season being postponed, that's Rob Manfred's fault. That's the owner's fault. Can they bargain in good faith? They can. They're making some progress. Let's go one at a time.
Yeah, sure. Well, let's go on. Well, okay. So take us through kind of like the major sticking points. There's, as we speak, there have been some announcements about a new proposal from MLB, which I haven't looked at deeply, but it feels like the kind of main sticking points being, I guess the main one being the competitive balance tax, CBT, and what will happen with that remain off the table at this point, untouched, unrecognized. So take us through what the main sticking points are and what's up with the CBT.
Yeah, so what's interesting at this point in bargaining is that they've pretty much, both sides have backed off their various radical proposals. So way back when the lockout first started, the union wanted earlier free agency, potentially earlier arbitration. They wanted to change revenue sharing. The league wanted these. This was a particular sticking point. The league wanted these really onerous additional taxes for teams that go over the luxury tax that would make it into even more of a salary cap than it is now. And at this point in bargaining, so they did make some progress while we were down in Florida bargaining for 9 days straight. Both sides have pretty much given up everything that isn't just arguing over numbers. So like they sort of agreed to a framework. A big part of the progress that the league has made, or that the union has elicited from the league, is that the owners have bought into this idea of a bonus pool for young players. That's a big deal. They're talking about a draft lottery. The union wants 6 picks. The league wants 5 picks. So all of this is stuff that they've actually agreed on, that is progress, but they're really far apart on like the literal numbers. Like at this point, it's essentially just the players asking for a quote unquote raise. You brought up the CBT. It's what we talk about as the luxury tax. So here's the sticking point there. So the CBT is like the quote unquote soft cap in baseball. It doesn't have a hard cap like other sports. It has this soft cap. If you go over a certain amount in payroll, you have to pay these taxes. And it just hasn't grown at the same rate as revenue. And if it doesn't grow at the same rate as revenue, then it becomes more and more like a cap over time. Like originally it was just supposed to affect like really extreme runaway spending. But if owners are making more and more money and the cap is only going up a little bit at a time, then it's affecting more and more teams until it's effectively a cap.
I guess if people weren't paying close attention, they might say, okay, well, the New York Mets spend like $200+ million on their squad, and then the Pittsburgh Pirates spend, I don't even know what the number is, but I'm guessing that it's like $200 million less or thereabouts. Yes. So why not, like if the Dodgers and the Mets and all the big marquee teams want to go crazy, then why not redistribute some of that money? What exactly what's the problem with that? And what is the problem with that?
Well, the problem with that is that like there isn't a floor. I mean, so leagues that have caps have floors. Baseball doesn't have a floor, and the union has never wanted to buy into that cap floor system. And so they're constantly having to push back against the CBT becoming more like a cap. You brought up the Mets, and like a big part of this is the fact that Steve Cohen clearly is more willing to like ball out than some of the other owners. And now other teams are concerned that they're not going to be able to keep up competitively.
This is one of the things that it feels like MLB is trying to solve for the issue of big market versus small market. big market drives the storylines. It's where all the best players are. That's when you watch Sports Center, the highlights are invariably going to be like Dodgers, Mets, Padres. It's going to Padres who have seen their market blow up in recent years, and then these small market teams are just kind of hanging around.
Well, that's not totally true. See, here's the thing. Small market teams do fine competitively. Like the league wants you to think.
But economically, it just feels like, how can we fix this when you have one team spending $200-something million and another one spending $50 million? And that's even before you start thinking about teams that are losing on purpose in order to better their draft position, which is a whole nother wrinkle to the issue of the CBT, because now you're just driving salaries down on purpose.
Yeah. I mean, so part of what the union had proposed that's now sort of not part of this is like a change to the revenue sharing system. They do have revenue sharing in baseball. So the big market teams give to the small market teams, and the union has long thought that the small market teams don't spend that money on their players and their on-field product enough. There's like several outstanding grievances that haven't been resolved. But part of what the union had proposed was like this incentive system for revenue sharing. I don't think this gets enough attention. So I actually thought this was like a really interesting and like literal idea that the union had, where small market teams that grow their local revenue, so like by getting more ticket sales, essentially, would get more in this like central revenue sharing. So it's like a reward system. But they would also lose revenue sharing if their local revenue went down, which could potentially condemn them to a cycle of just like being stuck at the bottom. But I thought that was actually really interesting, because you're right. It is difficult to incentivize teams to straight up spend. Like without a cap floor system, you're always having to do these like roundabout methods of like, how can you convince them to just spend that money on players? And you can't.
Rob Manfred is on one hand, I empathize with him in the sense that, he works for the owners. We all know that every commissioner works for the owners. He was put in there specifically because of labor issues, and he's fulfilling that role in the way that the owners want. But man, it feels like the hatred is reaching a new level. He laughed at a press conference recently, and that became a point of contention for a lot of people who are sad about baseball leaving, for players who feel like, is this guy taking this seriously? For, arena workers who are like, here's my boss laughing as I'm about to lose my job. And then, the players have just been teeing off on this guy. So what's going on there with the criticism of Manfred? And like, is any of this unfair to him? Takeline is brought to you by Underdog Fantasy. Woof woof. I want to tell you about the easiest, most fun way to spice up your season. It's Underdog Fantasy and their brand new Pick'em game. Just pick over-under on your favorite or least favorite, or the player you think is the funniest looking, or whatever, player's stats, and you can win up to 20 times, 20x, in a single night. Underdog keeps it super simple with their easy-to-use website and mobile apps. You just pick between 2 and 5 players, and you can take home some serious cash, folks. Use code TAKELINE and get your first deposit doubled by Underdog. For instance, if you deposit $50, you get $50 in bonus cash. If you deposit $100, you get $100 in bonus cash. How long can they keep this up? Deposit your money and find out.
Is any of this unfair to him? That's a great question. You know what I thought was unfair to him? People really got on him for practicing his golf swing.
That didn't
marketing. That didn't bother me. I was like,
that's not a big deal.
We've been sitting out here for 16 hours. You got to do something to keep yourself awake. That's the one thing I will say was unfair to Rob Manfred.
Right. Was it bad optics, kind of like the laugh? Yeah, sure. But at the same time, like, I don't care about that as much. The laugh was a little worse because it was like
it was at the press conference announcing that the season wouldn't start on time, which is a huge deal. It's the first time labor stoppage has affected the regular season since the 94-95 strike. I mean, that's a huge deal. I think like players and media and all are sort of correct to criticize Rob for as difficult as his job is. And I think you gave him a fair due, because you're right. It's a difficult job, particularly as markets get more and more disparate. That's a lot to sort of span. But the idea that like, we've talked about this last time I think I was on the show, that this is a fight that's been brewing for a really long time. And Rob has always like fashioned himself as a deal maker. He talked about it at his press conference at the owners' meetings, that sort of he oversaw the negotiations for several CBAs that didn't result in a work stoppage. And it's like, well, if that's the case, you kind of have to keep up with what's happening relationship wise between the league and the union. And he just didn't do that. Like it's like quite obvious with the way that 2020 played out, 2021 played out, and now this, that like, he didn't do a good job of keeping that discourse open and making players feel heard. And now they want to be heard even louder. They want to be heard when they're criticizing him. So I think everybody gets compared to their predecessors, and for all that Bud Selig did things wrong, people really had criticisms of the way that Bud Selig did the job. But yes, in retrospect, I think people are like, oh, wow, but he really loved the game because was a former owner and he was a big fan. And I think that like that helped him on the player side in a way that like Rob hasn't figured out what his connection to the players is in the same way that Bud had. Like, I'm a big fan of the Milwaukee Brewers and I made my life's goal to keep them in Milwaukee.
Other issues that have been discussed, some really interesting kind of like evolutions to the game are on the table. Expanding the playoff field feels like the one that's going to happen just from a revenue perspective, but also is one that you hear a lot of baseball fans complain about. Pitch clocks, banning defensive shifts. Is there anything in particular that you think you as a fan think needs to happen? Because one thing is always present in every baseball conversation is a anxiety about the future of baseball, the amount of, I was talking to a friend recently, they're like, man, I'm looking on social media and it's just like, baseball sucks, it's boring, it's mid. And it's like the amount of criticism that baseball gets on top of the legitimate issues about watchability in an increasingly dense entertainment space, the economics of it, all these things are important issues. But like, what do you think about some of these new tweaks that are on the table? And do you think they'll make an impact in terms of some of the issues and the real anxieties that baseball fans have about their sport?
I mean, I think there's sort of there's two categories. So the expanded postseason, and then there's these like on-field rule changes.
Right.
And you're right, we're definitely getting an expanded postseason.
That's going to happen.
They're fighting right now about whether or not it's going to be 12 teams or 14 teams. I think how that affects the sport will be really interesting because like we were talking earlier, what can you do to incentivize teams to actually try? And honestly, like changing the shape of the postseason field is a big part of that. Like I hope that we are able to come up with a way to do the postseason through these CBA talks that does work to both like incentivize teams to try harder without disincentivizing the teams at the top to want to win. So that's interesting. I think that'll be really interesting. I mean, that's something that like, regardless of whether or not you paid attention to the labor aspects of these talks, if you're a baseball fan, you will experience that in the very first season, whether that's 2022 or 2023. Like you'll notice that the postseason field is bigger. And then there's these like on-field rule changes. It's right now. So the news out of today is that the union, as part of a package, so nothing is done until everything is done, but as part of a package, signed off on giving the league power to implement pitch clocks, bigger bases, and banning the shift as soon as 2023. They rejected or sort of counter-proposed not letting the league implement robo-umps as soon as 2023. So, I mean, the pitch clock feels like, why not? Like, I just the game is too slow. So sure, put a F in.
And we've known this for years. We've talked about it for a long time. It's been on the table for a long period of time.
And like basically everyone in the minor leagues is playing with it because they've tested it at every level. So everyone who's coming up is used to it. Pitch clock, 1000%, put it in there for all I care. I think there should be a batter's box clock.
Yeah.
Stop letting them step out. Like keep that even. Bigger bases isn't really going to do much. They hope that it'll either make it safer or make it more likely that guys steal bases. I don't know if that's going to do anything. Banning the shift I don't like, but we don't have time to get into that. I think all of this is promising. I think it's like too small. Like, I think it's just tweaks. I think it's tweaks and it's rules on top of rules when I think that actually the game is due for like a much bigger rethinking of like how can you change the way that they're playing the sport? Because right now the problem is strikeouts, walks, and home runs are the only things that you can really like account for. And that's not going to get super affected by the rule changes.
Where do we go next? I remember as we were heading into these negotiations, a lot of the people that I've been listening to or reading are like, well, actually, you know, the two sides are not that far apart. And it feels like they're exactly the same amount apart as when this all started. And it's unclear to me that either side has a great off-ramp to come off their position. So where do we go from here?
I mean, that's a great question. I think, like, it felt like, so I went down to Florida thinking there's no way they're going to get a deal done. Right. And then by the end of the 9 days, I really thought, you know what? This is the time. I see them taking it seriously. I see them there every day, day in and day out, staying for long hours. They stayed till 4 a.m. one day. And I thought maybe they really will get a deal done. I feel like now that they didn't, I agree. I'm kind of like, okay, so we can't go back to talking once a week and exchanging one proposal on one thing and then waiting for the other side to counter on that one issue. I mean, so what we really need is like another deadline. And people have floated that like possibly the owners, the league side, the owners don't have to give back money for their TV deals until potentially like the end of April. So that could work as a pressure point. I mean, what we're really missing is another pressure point. Like what we saw is both sides willing to blow past opening day, cancel games. And if that's the case, then it's tough to figure out like, okay, so who blinks first? You both made your point. You're willing to lose games over whatever we're at in the difference. I think it's like 18 million on the CBT. It's like, it really does feel like it's like the distance between them is getting smaller, and yet the path to a deal doesn't look any more obvious.
Her name is Hannah Kaiser. She's a baseball writer covering the lockout for Yahoo Sports. Hannah, thanks for coming back. Always a delight to talk to you. Thanks for joining us.
Someday I'll be here to talk about the new CBA that they've agreed to.
I'm hopeful that it will happen soon.
Yes.